now. Okay, welcome to this meeting organized by the Discourse Unit with Elliot Cohen, Dr. Elliot Cohen, who's been involved in the Discourse Unit over the years, for many years. The Discourse Unit is an international research network based in Manchester, and we're very lucky to have Elliot here today to talk about his book, The Psychologization of Eastern Spiritual Traditions, Colonization, Translation, and Commodification. So we're going to spend a bit of time talking to Elliot about the book and then open up for discussion. So I want to start, Elliot, I wonder whether you could say a bit about yourself as a way of introduction, where you are and what you do.
Okay, well, I'm currently based at Leeds Beckett University, where we lecture in social psychology to the undergraduates, interdisciplinary psychology to the master students, and also supervise some PhDs that are more transpersonal psychology based. The work we do tends to be informed by more critical approaches, transpersonal approaches, and also psychoanalytic approaches as well. At the moment, we are sort of very much focused on establishing Leeds Beckett University as a centre for the study of transpersonal psychology in the UK, trying to make it a more critical, radical sort of approach to psychology, trying to make it much more interdisciplinary, and trying to also emphasize or encourage more diverse qualitative research around transpersonal psychology as well. And I've been there for, I think, coming up to 15 years almost. At Leeds Beckett, it's been quite a while. I'm a psychologist by training. I've worked as a psychotherapist for many years as well, both in the NHS and in private practice. That was mostly in psychodrama, creative arts therapies, and mindfulness-based approaches before it became the big buzzword that it is now. And that's pretty much where I am at the moment. My own interest in this is I've been studying sort of Eastern spiritual traditions, primarily Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism, for many years now. For 25 plus years, I've been sort of studying, a student in these different traditions, different lineages, and I think that's certainly one of the things we encourage in transpersonal psychology, not just a passive theoretical understanding, but more an immersive understanding, trying to immerse yourself in these traditions, trying to get that emic sort of insider perspective as much as possible.
Okay, good. That's useful. And Elliot, are you or have you ever been a Buddhist?
Have you ever? That sounds like an interrogation. I've certainly been sort of a long-term student of the Buddha Dharma since I was 17. As you can probably tell from my name, sort of culturally Jewish background. And there is actually a very interesting phenomena. It's more probably in the States, where they refer to Jubus or Jewish Buddhists, and I have been sort of labeled that in the past, but you know, I've also been called a Hindu at different points as well, when I was studying Vedanta, Advaita Vedanta, Shaivism or Vaishnavism, and studying Taoism. I think my wife's got the best joke of this, because it's sort of Buddhism and Taoism have perhaps been two of the main areas that I've been studying. And when she says, you know, what's your religion? It says Bu Ju Dao. It says Buja Dao, which in Chinese means like I don't know. So it's just like you end up in a place of sort of contented puzzlement, maybe. But I think sort of my interspiritual, perhaps, very much open to these different wisdom traditions and certainly the benefits of these practices.
Okay, well, let's get to the book. I'm just going to share the screen for a moment so people can see the lovely cover of the book.
It is a lovely cover, and people, you know, I would like you to judge the book on the merit of its cover. It's, you know, you can put it in the shelf, or you can just frame it. You know?
Yes, it'd be worth the price just for that.
I think so.
Even with the discount using Fly 21.
The price is actually cheaper than my my commute to Leeds, so that's, you know, putting it in perspective.
Okay, good. So I mean, it's a lovely cover. I'm still admitting people to the meeting. I'm going to stop sharing, and I want you to start by just telling us a little bit about what these Eastern spiritual traditions are that you're talking about in the book. What do they cover?
Right. Well, I was sort of playing around for some time with the title and what to refer to these traditions as. So in transpersonal psychology, often we use the term wisdom traditions. More sort of scholarly, sort of academic sinologist friends would probably use the term Asian religions. But I thought Eastern spiritual traditions sounded a little bit softer, a little bit more inclusive, perhaps. I'm also very familiar with the tendency of many people to describe themselves as spiritual rather than religious, although personally I've got no problem with the term religious or religion, and I certainly do treat Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism as religions, rather than just sort of saying that they are simple philosophies or psychologies or psychotherapies. I think we need to appreciate them for the sort of the richness and complexity that they carry, including the cultural contexts. So I'm referring primarily in Eastern spiritual traditions to sort of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Taoism, and I'm trying to treat them in a way that isn't too essentialist, and recognize that they are all sort of very broad, complex traditions. So, you know, we can talk about Buddhism. It's really Buddhisms. You know, there's different schools. There's the Theravada, there's the Mahayana, there's the Vajrayana, and, you know, in each one of those there are different subsects and movements. So, for instance, a lot of people think the Dalai Lama is the head of Tibetan Buddhism, when actually he's just the head of the Gelugpa school, the yellow hat school of Tibetan Buddhism. And there's several other schools, some of which are significantly older than that school, such as the Nyingmapa school. So one of the things I hope to do is to give a sense of the variety of different traditions, and sort of not reduce them or essentialize them. I hope I've managed to do that, but I guess I'll let the reading public decide. I think sometimes, because of the nature of what I'm talking about, you know, the idea of psychologization, that in a sense that really begins that process of essentializing, but I'll probably talk more about that when we're talking about psychologization.
But to say Eastern spiritual traditions positions the author and the reader in some ways as being not in the East. So Eastern is a kind of geographical covering term as well as conceptual, is it? Is that the way you understand it?
It is, and one of the things I talk about, particularly in the very first chapter, are the various fantasies, idealizations, projections about the East, sort of Orientalist fantasies, the whole mythos, if you like, of East and West, the Oriental and the Occidental. These terms have really fallen out of fashion now. it seems. But the idea of the East, not just as a geographical location, place, context, but as a state of mind, is something that I particularly focus on. The idea that, let's say, for instance, Zen has become largely, I think, divorced from the traditional Chinese and Japanese context, and now you'll find it's it's just used as an expression for an aesthetic. This is very Zen, or this is sort of a mood, or it's a state of mind, or calm. I forget who the former Speaker of the House was in the House of Commons, but I remember sometimes when things were getting a little bit hectic, he would say, "Gentlemen, gentlemen, Zen, Zen, more Zen." So this term becomes kind of divorced from its original culture and context, and becomes almost like a state of mind. I talk a little bit more about that with the idea of Tibet as well, the mind's Tibet, the various fantasies and idealization. So when I'm using the term idealization, I'm using it in a twofold way. One is this idea that it's idealized, that Tibetan Buddhism, the Tibetans themselves, are very much kind of romanticized into these sort of superhuman spiritual athletes, and that puts an awful lot of pressure on Tibetan people to kind of conform to those stereotypes and expectations. But it's also, to what extent does it have any basis in reality? In if you go to Tibet or the Tibetan diaspora, maybe in Ladakh or certain parts of northern India, it's a real culture with real language, with all the sort of rich diversity and complexity. And I think we're still very much stuck in this Shangri-La romantic fantasy about Tibet and Tibetans, which was another thing that I wanted to sort of challenge in the book, and sort of how do we grow beyond that. I keep using Edward Said's term, this sort of slow growing together, this phrase taken from his seminal text, Orientalism. And I think that that's really kind of the way forward here, this slow growing together.
And I suppose what you've been talking about there is precisely the legacy of colonization, the way that translation is always embedded in that colonization, and it turns practices into things that can be bought and sold. And I suppose there's the commodification as well. But there's quite a specific critique that you're elaborating in the book, which is using this term psychologization. Psychologization in some ways seems to be a coverall term that will enable us to grasp in a conceptual, deeper conceptual way the problem of colonization and translation and commodification. Could you say a bit about what psychologization is for you in this book?
Well, yeah, I think, from one of the very first papers that I did in this subject was back in 2010, and that was about the psychologization of Buddhism. That was the subtitle. I believe the original title was From the Bodhi Tree to the Analyst's Couch, then into the MRI Scanner, which sort of put me into conversation with other writers in psychologization, particularly Jan de Vos, who wrote the Psychologization in Times of Globalization, and this idea that psychology kind of spills out, overflows sort of into culture and becomes sort of buzzwords and pop psychology. So it's interesting today how there is sort of the whole rhetoric or discourse around resilience, well-being, and this kind of feeds into these certain remedies or practices or solutions, particularly sort of mindfulness. I keep talking about mindfulness in this book. It keeps popping up, authors like Purser, who did Muck Mindfulness, Ron Purser, which is a wonderful book, which I do sort of discuss in there. Say that this is a form of capitalist spirituality, that sort of the neoliberals have somehow taken it over and privatized it and sort of commodified it. And I look at that, but hopefully I think I do it. I try to be quite nuanced in that, because I do recognize that there are quite a lot of Buddhist practitioners, particularly indigenous Buddhists, who are very open to psychologization, perhaps used from their perspective less in the more reductionist, more critical term that I've been using it in. But I got one quote in the chapter on Buddhism by a sort of quite esteemed Tibetan Buddhist teacher, Lama, Rinpoche, Dr. Nida Chenaksang, who's becoming sort of something of a rising star sort of figure in the world of Tibetan Buddhism. Certainly great Buddhologists like Robert Thurman are sort of taking great interest in his work and writings, because he's writing in a very open, accessible way about what were previously very hidden, esoteric teachings. But Chenaksang in his work is very happy for people to relate to Tibetan Buddhism as a form of psychology. As far as he's concerned, it's a very good form of psychology. It's a way to understand, to treat the mind, to navigate the mind, to purify the mind and one's vision. And I think we find this trend, you might say, from, I guess, the sort of 19th century onwards, this sort of modernist trends in Buddhism, in Burma, in Myanmar, in Thailand, in Sri Lanka, this transformation of Buddhism into a mind science. We see it in China as well.
Is this psychology in a different way from the way that we understand it in the psychology textbooks and the pop psychology? It seems that you're talking about psychologization here in two ways. One is a negative way, which is the way that things are commodified and incorporated into the discipline of psychology, which kind of betrays the systems of belief that you're talking about. But you're also talking about reclaiming something of psychology, everyday psychology, something that could be liberating, transpersonal. Is that's what's going on here, is it?
It is exactly what's going on. I think that's quite a succinct way of talking about what I'm trying to do. And I'm looking at what you might refer to as more sort of indigenous forms of what we might refer to as psychology, and certainly what many Buddhist teachers will also refer to as psychology, but in a different way. You might say that from the perspective of what we could maybe call Buddhist psychology, were essentially about studying the impure or deluded mind. So it's already, there's an inherent critique in there. So a Taoist approach to psychology would see us initially as studying a mind and body that is essentially out of harmony with the Tao, with with heaven, earth, and humanity, that we both internally and externally are out of kilter, off balance. That would be ordinary psychology. And I remember one of my very first conversations with one of the swamis at the Vedanta study circle in Manchester. He was very excited when he found out I was a psychologist, and he said, "Oh, I'm also a psychologist." He says, "But you study the surface of the mind. If you like, you study sort of the waves at the top, and I study the depths below. It says I study Atma Vidya, and that idea of the Vidya, the science, the knowledge of Atma, the self or the soul. So this idea that Western psychology would essentially be the psychology of Maya or illusion, or from a Buddhist perspective, samsaric psychology. This is a psychology of a mind that is, in a sense, warped and distorted by ignorance, hatred, and craving. So I think within these traditions already there is an inherent critique of psychology, and arguably psychotherapy as well.
And you worked as a psychotherapist, so you can see that the way that this might work its way through in a progressive way in practice. Is that right?
I think with time, I think the danger with these things is rushing it, and I think we need a lot more dialogue with indigenous practitioners. I think we've been in a big rush, particularly in the West, to Westernize Buddhism. And my understanding of the history of Buddhism and Taoism as well, but I think Buddhism has traveled more, or maybe has spread more successfully than maybe Taoism. Maybe some scholars might want to take me up on that, but I think one of the things is that whenever Buddhism's traveled to another country, it's taken sometimes several centuries for indigenous forms of that tradition to arise. So, for instance, when Buddhism went from India to China, there's sort of several pilgrimages and visits that led to this sort of transmission. And, it really takes sort of a few centuries before some of those first schools, probably the Tian Tai school or schools based around the flower ornament sutra, that start, and that they are a more very sort of Chinese style of Buddhism, often incorporating certain aspects of Confucian values or Taoist ideas. It's often said, for instance, that Chan is or Zen is something of a blending of Buddhist ideas, ideals, and Taoist ideas and ideals.
Okay, yeah, that's really useful. But I mean, it seems like psychologization, in the way that you're using it, is partly a synonym for Westernization.
Yeah.
But also what you're leaving open here is the possibility that there could be Western spiritual traditions, in the same way as Buddhism has traveled to other countries and become rooted in those cultures and developed in their own specific ways, that it's possible that people might reclaim something of their understanding of these traditions and make them their own. And that's not always a bad thing. It's not always commodification, translation, and colonization. So
no, it's not. Yeah. And I think also a big part of the purpose of psychologization, in perhaps the more neutral sense, is that it's really been the way these texts and teachings have been translated through that lens of psychology. So if we look at some of those earliest writings, I talk about Rhys David's work on from the Pali Text Society. One of her earliest books was on sort of Buddhism psychology. I think it was related to ethics, and I talk about that book in the first chapter. It's very interesting that in that sort of that early period, they were already talking about Buddhism through that lens of psychology. And one of the questions I asked was, what was psychology back then? Because one of the few psychologists that gets mentioned is William James, which gives you a sense of the time of when they were writing. And William James is perhaps celebrated as one of the founders of transpersonal psychology and also the psychology of religion. He wrote that classic, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And so it's very interesting that she's writing about the introspective genius of the East, and then psychology within the next few decades had moved very far away from introspection and was moving towards much more experimental modes and methods.
Yes, psychology is very different today than what it was 100 years ago, isn't it?
Very much so. So, you know, I'm trying to sort of keep up to date. So I suppose ordering the book, the narrative is more sort of chronological, and it's kind of some of the highlights from these different dialogues, some of the hits, some of the misses.
Yeah. Can you take us through the narrative of the book, and then maybe that?
Yeah. So we sort of I begin with the classic line from Kipling: "East is east and west and west, and never the twain shall meet." It was always a line that stuck in my head. We had to learn it at school for an English. It never left, but it always stuck with me. You know, what is East? What is West? What are these sort of dichotomous ways of thinking and relating to each other? So I begin with this sort of exploration, and then we look a little bit at this history of colonialism and these attitudes of superiority. The idea somehow that Westerners in these early translations, we had the pure stuff. We could find the true Hinduism or the true Buddhism or the true Taoism without the cultural baggage. I mean, this is a language. This is language that's still thrown around a lot today, particularly with Western practitioners. I want a Taoism that doesn't have the cultural baggage. You know, I've read Lao Tzu or the Tao of Pu, and you know that's what I want. That's what I like. I don't like it when they're burning talismans or chanting. So you might not like that, but that's quite an integral part of Taoism as a religion that's practiced. And they said, well, no, that's the cultural baggage. And my usual response to that is, well, you know, that's a bit dismissive. You know, if you think about the last time you lost your luggage at the airport and how you felt, you know, you need your bags. All your stuff is in them. That it matters. The so-called cultural baggage, it matters. That's where the lived experience, the sort of the cultural transmission, the context, often the commentaries and explanation. And I think there's a real danger sometimes of something of a Western sort of secular tendency. You see it sometimes in approaches like secular Buddhism, of stripping it down, getting rid. You know, although I do greatly admire Stephen Batchelor, this idea of Buddhism without beliefs, which was the name of one of his books. And I think this is almost, for some people, like the fantasy. This is the ideal, to have the Buddhism without the beliefs, or to have the Taoism without the beliefs. It's like the kind of outdated idea now that gets you in trouble with any scholars of Taoism or sinologists if you distinguish between the good philosophical Taoism and the religious Taoism. And you know, that's if you go to China, if you go to Taiwan or Singapore and you meet practicing Taoists, you see it's far richer, far more complex than these more sort of reduced, essentialized forms. But I think we've had something of a tendency historically in the West to think we can find the pure version of this that's uncorrupted. We can find the pure Buddhism or the pure Hinduism. I think for many years there was, and I do talk about Vivekananda and popularizing Advaita Vedanta in the West, these teachings of Vedanta, these very high, profound teachings that he presented in a very kind of sort of almost like a rationalist way to appeal to the Western audience and to show how sophisticated these were. And I think today we have sort of the legacy of that. Is when most people think about Hinduism, they think of it just in terms of Vedanta. They don't know about Shaivism or Vaishnavism, that sort of most Hindus would probably define or describe themselves as being in sort of devotees of Shiva or Vishnu. And likewise with Buddhism, you know, I'm a member of lots of Buddhist groups on Facebook and Taoist groups, and it's always interesting listening to the way people self-define. It's a philosophy, not a religion. People say quite emphatically, and you know, this allows people to kind of make what I refer to in the book as a kind of a bespoke Buddhism. I will tailor it to suit my particular needs. And I think the mindfulness movement, if we look at mindfulness, if we look at the Noble Eightfold Path of Buddhism, mindfulness is just one of those paths, of the Noble Eightfold Path, but it becomes almost like the entire path in sort of more mindfulness-based approaches, divorced from its context, divorced from its sort of spiritual roots, other practices, other teachings that would give it more meaning. So the book sort of goes through these different traditions. I start with Buddhism, and then I move to Taoism, and then I look at the commodification, and I think part of that is kind of the popularization as well. And I try to be quite even-handed in this. I recognize that it's been commodified because it's become popular, and I'm wary to be too critical of this, because I don't want to be accused of being a gatekeeper, saying this isn't real Buddhism. And I think I used the example of one point of almost like when a band becomes too famous, too popular, and they're accused of selling out. Well, have they actually sold out, or have they just become popular? Can the music retain its revolutionary, sort of radical, sort of gritty sound, or does it inevitably become sort of overproduced, sort of commodified? The music industry, the music business, the mindfulness industry they're talking about, and that's, it is big business.
Well, usually, I mean, when people talk about mindfulness, they mean filling the mind with all the stuff of psychology and what psychologists know about the mind. It's always puzzled me, this phrase. Maybe we should talk about mindlessness as a better approach.
Well, I think one of the best things to do is to sort of clarify, is maybe to go back to some of the original language. So if we're talking about the idea of sati or mindfulness, it's got a lot of meanings. I mean, the etymology also refers to ideas of remembering and recollection, as well as just directing one's attention. And I think the question there becomes, on what is one directing one's attention? So in the context of Buddhism, you would be probably directing your attention on the Buddha Dharma, on the Buddha's teachings, on some of those key teachings of dukkha, unsatisfactoriness, anicca, impermanence, or anatta, not self. You wouldn't simply be observing the mind, sort of in this, just in sort of the mind, observing the mind. It's done within a broader context of these teachings, and I think divorced from that, it just becomes a little bit, I think is solipsistic the word. I think it is a danger almost of just becoming a little bit too mind-centered, and ultimately self-centered, when it's decontextualized in this way.
Okay, good. I'm wondering whether we should now open things up a bit more. I'm going to first of all put the link for the book in the chat. That's coming in now. If I can just do that. Now you can see the link, and then if you put in this discount code when you're ordering the book, which is FLY21, then you'll be able to get it a bit cheaper, and it'll still be really fantastic value. I'm going to stop the recording now,